One of the crazier things we find when we look back in history is that we find our ancestors seem to be talking about an Earth that no longer exists. Now, I do not mean that they were living on a different planet or something like that. We're not going that schizo just yet. What I mean is that when we read all of these legends, mythologies, ultimately their histories, we find ourselves running into a situation where the environment that they are living in is completely different to how we see the Earth today. For example, one of the very weird and interesting things that we find when we start to look back at all of the world's ancient cultures, legends and mythologies and histories, we find a situation to where everybody, for some weird reason, seems to have a mountain building creation story. So by that, what I mean is that in these mythologies, the land is essentially flat, happy, it's all good, everybody's partying, and then something will happen, and then these mountain ranges will spring up literally overnight. Now, obviously, this flies in the face of mainstream science and geology when it comes to how mountains are formed, because remember, mainstream scientists, geologists, whatever, they all believe that all of these mountain ranges on the planet took hundreds of millions of years to reach their present elevations. But is that true? Because we have a problem. Like I said, for whatever reason, the vast majority of cultures on this planet who have a history that goes back far enough, everybody claims that all of these mountain ranges sprung up out of the ground overnight. It gets even crazier because these stories are not told as in a sense of, yeah, Joe was walking along and then suddenly the Himalayas appeared right in front of him and then he blessed them with whatever god and then he walked away. That is not how these stories are generally told. Well, not even generally. They're not told like that at all. When we start to look back at ancient cultures' mythologies, we find a situation that is quite common amongst all of them. And that is, there was a great destructive force that the earth ran into, and this destructive force is the cause of mountain building. Now, every single culture that has a mountain building mythology all kind of follow the exact same formula. Everybody blames some gods in the skies for creating all of these mountain ranges. Now, that's weird in and of itself. I mean, how is it that we find cultures all over this planet essentially creating the exact same myth? This is a legitimate question. How is this happening? Now, I'm not going to get into that aspect of it necessarily because that's not for this show. But regardless, if you're a historian, that's a question that needs to be answered. And the answer of something stupid like a philosophical situation like, I don't know, I think the Jungian crap says something about what archetypes. Oh yeah, just all the humans, they naturally have these weird psychological archetypes that would magically make everybody create the exact same mythology at the exact same time all over the planet. That is literally one of the explanations that historians or scientists will give as an excuse for the observational fact that cultures all over this planet created the exact same kinds of mythologies. Now, we're going to focus on mountain building, so I'm not going to get too crazy in any other direction, and I will try and stay focused. I know I babble, and we have a lot to cover today because we have a lot to read through, but I want, anyway, okay. So, but that's a problem, right? Why do we find cultures all over this planet claiming that mountains sprung up overnight? And that is literally their claim. Right? These cultures say that yes, we were all having fun one day, running around, and then all of a sudden the gods in the sky show up and absolutely destroy Earth. And there's all kinds of things that go on during this mountain building situation. And I'm not going to cover all the other crazy events that go along with this. We're just going to focus on the mountains rising up out of the ground overnight. But it's very important to understand that not only do mountains rise up, We also find many other situations happening simultaneously. And interestingly enough, if mountain ranges literally rose overnight, we would actually expect the stories to reflect the other aspects that they do indeed record. And that's from a scientific perspective. All right, now, so most of you are probably like, all right, but dude, I mean, it does take millions of years. Our scientists know this for a fact. Haven't you heard of the tectonic plate theory? Two plates rub against each other and then they magically create mountains over billions of years? Like that's the story. And most people agree with that. And we covered that in kind of the first part of this video, which I'll try to link. I probably won't. I'll try to remember. This is kind of a part 2. I highly recommend going to watch the first one with respect to mountain building before you get into this one, because you'll need to know a little bit of that to know where we are going here. But if you don't, that's fine. I get it. This channel sucks. I wouldn't go look at it either. It's fine. Anyway, so the claim being made by our ancestors is that all of the mountain ranges on this planet sprung up overnight. And that includes mountain ranges like the Andes, 6,000 feet high plus or something like that. That means Mount Everest literally would have sprung up overnight. Was he like 29,000 or something? It's crazy. Like that is an absolute insane elevation. But the ancients very specifically say that these mountain ranges were lifted up in one catastrophic event. Now, is that possible? Is it possible to have mountain ranges spring up overnight? I mean, most people, when they hear that, they are going to immediately reject the idea, not because they have looked at the situation through a scientific lens, but simply because they have been told and taught that mountain building takes hundreds of billions of years to happen. And since this has been drilled into everybody's head in the West, only in the West, I'm only talking about the westernized civilization people, everybody has had this told to them ad nauseum their entire life, so that's what everybody believes now. To make it even worse, there's a little bit of logic to it. It kind of sounds like, right? You think, okay, fine, two plates smashing together. Yeah, I guess over 100 million years, I guess a mountain range could form. Yeah, that makes sense. There's a problem immediately, by the way, with this theory. Mountain building through the use of tectonic plates means that the tectonic theory has to be a fact. If plate tectonics is not real, if that theory is wrong, then that changes mountain building immediately. Most people on this planet are not questioning plate tectonics, and they certainly are not questioning mountain building. Remember, both are theories. These are not proven facts. Now, I want to get into mountain building for two main reasons. The first reason is I want to continue to make the case to show you that the Ice Age never existed. We have got to get rid of this stupid concept of the Ice Age if we are going to make any progress at all with respect to understanding our true history. The second thing that we will get out of this mountain building stuff is that we can start to make sense of a lot of the histories that all of our ancestors, painstakingly recorded and tried to report on down the generations so that you and I could hear it and then finally try to learn what happened. Unfortunately, that's not happening, obviously. Today, the vast majority of people, unfortunately, completely discard anything that is considered a mythology or a legend, and of course also religions now as well. And there's not, I don't blame anybody for doing a lot of that. When you look at some of these stories, so for example, in North America, right, American Indians and North American Indians, they have mountain building stories as well, right? They have these things called thunderbirds that show up, and they start to annihilate all kinds of huge wildlife. That's interesting in and of itself. But what these thunderbirds also do is they rip up mountains. They literally create mountains right in front of the tribes that lived in North America during this time period. right? And that's what they record. They don't say that, oh yeah, we watched earthquakes slowly happen and these mountains built up over billions of years. Nobody has this theory. Nobody is agreeing with geologists. That is a completely new phenomena, this weird mountain building situation of hundreds of millions of years. All of our ancestors are very poignant when they say something happened in the sky and that affected Earth on a catastrophic level. And one of the outcomes was huge mountain ranges being ripped up out of the crust, or just built up on top of the crust. Now, I just gave all of you two different ways of mountains potentially being built, and this is what is recorded in the various histories and mythologies of cultures all over the planet. We find two main mountain building phenomena. One is simply huge chunks of earth just being ripped up out of the ground. And that is where we would find a lot of plutons, or we would find a lot of massifs, or basically any kind of a hardcore granite mountain range. You would find this being ripped up from the crust. And that is exactly what people describe. There's another way of building mountains as well, which we're not going to go too crazy on today because we're still trying to build a foundation, but I just want to throw some of this out there so that everybody understands that mountain building is extremely interesting, and there's not only one way to do it. The other way to do it is by having electrical storms passing over the planet, and as these storms sweep along, in certain areas, depending on the electrical potential and what's going on in the area itself, what you will find is basically electrolyzed wind. Is that a word? Electrolyzed? Wind that is charged. Much better word. You'll find a charged wind blowing over the planet. What this wind will do is that it will blow all that dust and debris, it will heat it up, and then it will electromagnetically seal it on top of each other against smaller dunes. As this happens, what you will find is you will find layers of dirt built up really quick, not over millions of years, not thousands, not even a year. Literally in a few hours, you can make mountains hundreds or thousands of feet tall just by stacking layers of charged dust. Now, when this dust gets blown into each other, they stick to each other, the heat is there, the heat melds them together, and then that is where you will see mountain ranges like what you find, for example, in the Sierra Nevadas. I'm not going to go too much crazier on the mountain building side. Like I said, I still want to we're still trying to build up a foundation. But just so you know, mountain building is a very, very interesting problem, and it's one that mainstream scientists are nowhere near close to truly understanding because they do not want to look at the real science, and they'll never figure it out. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to continue to build up our case to show everybody that our ancestors may not have been lying when they say mountain ranges were built overnight. Now, another interesting facet about the mountain range situation popping up overnight is that these events did not take place hundreds of millions of years ago, or millions of years ago, or even tens of thousands of years ago. The crazier part of the mountain building situation that we find embedded into mythologies and histories is that these events took place only a few thousand years ago. This is what our ancestors claim. Our ancestors' stories about the mountains popping up overnight, they are not millions of years old, right? We are not getting information transmitted from people, millennia to the 8th power ago, right? We're not getting those stories. Those stories wouldn't survive anyways. That's too long of a time period. That's something to think about, by the way, actually. But let's do this side note really quick. Remember, a lot of the histories that we have were orally transmitted down the line, right? With that, if you have 20,000 years worth of oral transmission, do you really believe that story is going to be all that reliable? It gets complicated. We start to run into problems. Now, even if you were to write down your stories, say, just say the events took place, 40,000 years ago or something. Even if humans were still recording by the written word, Do you honestly believe we would receive that written word 40,000 years later in its true accuracy? No, probably not. And in fact, I would bet that you would never see anything like that at all unless it was recorded on indestructible paper and language never changed. That, of course, doesn't happen. The reason why I point all of that out is because we are getting these stories that show up right now in our time period. We know they've probably been, changed a little bit here and there. And by changed a little bit, what I mean is that as time marches on, the descendants are going to have less and less attachment to the events as if they were real. So what will happen is that eventually things will kind of be softened, because the people telling the story, say 1,000 years later, they're so disassociated from the original event. They're not going to be able to recall that event with the same fervor that the people who originally created the tale would. Right? So, and over time, things are just going to degrade. We cannot get away from the second law of thermodynamics. At least that's the way it seems right now. So I'll just operate on that. Things decay. Stories would decay. So the way we're getting these stories now is that they're not 10 billion years old. They're literally, at best, only a few thousand years old. We can prove this because everybody's stories parallel one another, generally speaking. Now, what we can do is we can also look at some of the histories and we can see where things may have been altered, deleted, etc., because there's other copies of the stories floating around that are more original. Anyways, my main point is that these events could not have happened billions or tens of thousands of years ago. They would have had to have happened only a few thousand years ago for the transmission to work to the degree of detail that it does work at right now. Does that make sense? Did I even explain that right? To make matters even more interesting, our ancestors don't claim that these stories are billions of years old. Now, I know you can point to some cultures and the way they did their calendar, and you can say, well, they do say it was 100,000 years ago that X event happened. But when you look at their dating system and you translate that dating system into a more common dating system, regular 365-day years right now, you run into other problems simply because the calendar was not always 365. But what you find is that, no, it's not 100,000 years ago that an event took place. In real time, it only took place a few thousand years ago. And this is shown all kinds. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that either. The main point of what I'm trying to say here, ultimately, or the claim by our ancestors, and then interestingly enough by mainstream scientists, is that all of the mountains on this planet right now at their current heights, they reached those elevations only a few thousand years ago. And this is a claim made by both sides. Both ancient cultures and the mainstream geological institutions are actually making the claim that these mountain ranges are all extremely recent. This is what I want to talk about. So here's the deal, right? One of the things that we are trying to figure out as historians is we're trying to make sense of all the stuff that our ancestors talk about. We're trying to make sense of all the stuff that we see on Earth, whether it be ancient ruins that we have no idea who built them, whether it be, weird geological formations that our ancestors talk about watching being created, or missing geological locations that our ancestors record once being somewhere, but are now long gone. So, for example, in that case, you could talk about something like Lake Triton. Lake Triton is probably what is responsible for all of the desert sand over there in the Sahara. It's very interesting, but that lake is obviously gone now, right? I mean, nobody's over there. Nobody's going to Lake Triton to get a tan. Nobody's doing that because it's gone. It does not exist. These are the problems that as objective historians that we have, and we need to figure out answers. So in this show, what I want to do is I want to go over more of the problems of mountain building, and I want to show you guys more scientific evidence about why we can make the claim that these mountains rose only a few thousand years ago. Why do we want to do that anyway? Well, because right now, if we follow what our ancestors are talking about and we take it as an actual history, if we read and listen to what they are saying and take it seriously, suddenly a lot of the problems that we are having with respect to trying to understand Earth, for example, start to come into more focus. How do they do that? Well, our ancestors talk about huge, destructive cataclysms smashing into Earth throughout multiple periods in history. Now, if only one culture was talking about catastrophes, fine, whatever, we would move on. We would call that culture imaginative, and then, we would hand wave it away as fantasy, and we would just continue on about our day. The problem is that cultures all over this world have the exact same stories. To make it even more interesting, their stories or mythologies, or ultimately I am just going to call them histories, their histories are told from a perspective, their perspective. Now, I know that sounds stupid initially, but think about this. If there was a planet-wide catastrophe, and by its very nature it has to be planet-wide, right? The entire planet is going to feel the effects. We would not expect the entire planet to see and feel the exact same thing. By that I mean somebody over living in the, northern hemisphere of North America will see the effects of a planet-wide cosmological catastrophe differently than somebody who lives in, say, Australia, right, in the southern hemisphere. And the reason why is simple. Their perspectives are different. Their landscapes are different, right? The geological makeup is different. Hell, even the sky they're looking at is literally different. So anything that may have happened cosmologically that would have affected Earth would have necessarily created different perspectives. And so we would expect to find those kinds of differentiating points of view in the mythologies. Guess what? That's exactly what we find. Historians ignore this, right? It's absolutely insane. It's funny, when you compare two historical events from two different cultures, initially they may seem like they have nothing to do with one another. However, if you locate them geologically where they actually were and what they could have been seeing relative to what events were happening, suddenly you can start to paint a broader picture, because now you're getting both the northern hemisphere perspective and the southern hemisphere perspective. So if you're a cosmologist or an astronomer, you can actually use some of their descriptions to get an idea of what was flying where and what was going on in the sky, for example. There might be other areas to where certain cultures literally watched mountains being ripped up overnight or being created through an electrical process, and other cultures in other areas of the world may have actually witnessed the exact opposite. Not only did they not see mountains being built, they actually watched continents and islands sink. This is where things start to line up, and this is where it gets crazy, right? Our ancestors witnessed these events and they line up. So our basic premise is this. Our ancestors' stories of catastrophes are real, and we are going to take them seriously. But if these things are real, then we better have the scientific evidence to support that, right? If we are going to make the claim that mountain ranges, all of these mountain ranges all over Earth, sprung up only in the past few thousand years overnight, we better have some damn good evidence. Now, the first video in this little mountain building section covers the introduction to all of that and starts to show you the possibilities. What we are going to do now is we are going to build on top of that first video and show even more scientific evidence that proves the claim made by our ancestors. As a little side note, for those of you who are religious, or, well, basically anybody who believes the deluge happened, the Noah story, for example, or the Utnapishtim story, whatever character you've got back there, if you are currently a believer in the deluge, from a religious standpoint, I'm just going to talk from that point of view, because the deluge is technically a scientific reality as well. But anyway, one of the problems with the deluge, of course, is the claim that the waters that rained down on Earth, overflowed the highest mountain. Now, what did I just get done telling you about for the last 20 minutes? I just told you that mountain ranges popped up only a few thousand years ago. So, if the deluge took place before all of these mountains rose up, suddenly reaching the highest mountain peak, or water, flooding the world at the world's highest mountain peak, you are no longer dealing with mountain peaks that are 29,000 feet tall. You are now dealing with low-lying hills that are maybe no more than a few hundred to maybe 1,000 feet in elevation. It changes everything. The problem that a lot of researchers have, and this is a general problem, by the way, I'm not just talking about, the deluge situation. Generally speaking, nobody wants to admit the possibility that the Earth was simply geologically different just a little bit ago. We're getting closer to the point to where people are starting to warm up to the idea that our current geological orientation, where north-south is right now, or I guess another way to put it would be, right now you can look at all the latitudes on Earth and you can, triangulate something relative to current latitudes and of course longitude. But what if the continents were in different locations, relatively speaking, to those latitudes because the Earth was oriented differently? If that's the case, then suddenly you are in a situation to where we no longer know what Earth actually looked like only a few thousand years ago. Basically, everybody who's doing research right now, not everybody, but the vast majority of people who do research, they look at planet Earth as it is now, and they try to fit in all of their theories with respect to the current configuration of Earth. If Earth was completely different a few thousand years ago, not only, the shorelines, not only the potentiality, I guess we should say. Is that a word? Potential? Yeah, I think it is. Even the potential existence of other islands and continents, which are now sunken below the Earth, the geography of Earth would be completely different. So if you're trying to fit in your pet theory with the world's current configuration, it's never going to work. You will fail every time because you are not working in reality. Now, I don't have a great way of bringing back the original topography of Earth without finding some sort of an ancient map or something like that. I mean, this is one of the problems that we are suffering from right now, because all of the evidence is starting to prove that Earth's configuration, its geography, was vastly different than it is today. And of course, all of our ancestors' histories would corroborate this possibility. Or I should say, it corroborates the reality. So anyway, just a heads up, two things there. One, the deluge actually could be feasible if the mountain ranges that we see now did not exist, right? That's one scientific possibility, to create a situation where the deluge could be true. And that is a real possibility, actually. I'm not going to get into it. I'll keep moving on. I know I'm trying to get to the science. And then the other part of this is the fact that we just have to remember that there is a high possibility, and in all honesty, it's a fact at this point in time, that the Earth simply looked geologically different just a few thousand years ago. So you cannot use the current shorelines, you cannot use the current geography to try and map human migrations, for example, because they don't make sense. Another example, really fast. I know I keep going off track, but it's hilarious. So let's talk about it like this, and we'll do another. You know what? Never mind. We'll do a show on that later. Okay, let's get to the science that is building a case for the existence of mountain ranges only happening in the past few thousand years. Now, I'm going to read a section from a book called Cataclysm, with an exclamation point. This is by Allen and Dallaire. These are two geologists from mainstream institutions. So any of you out there who think I'm about to read schizo stuff. Nope, this is directly from science people. But these guys are one of the good ones. Remember, not all mainstream people are bad. I always like to say that because I know I rag on those guys like crazy. There's some really good and talented people in the mainstream arena. You know, you just don't know about them generally. It's hard to find these guys. So in fact, actually, if you guys can do me a favor, feel free to link me other people who are looking at this evidence objectively. I would love to read whatever else you guys might have. That's like literally one of the reasons why I made this channel, was to try to find more stuff, because man, sometimes finding objective evidence is very difficult. You know, we all know what's going on with the censorship situation here in the West. You know, it's getting bad. Okay. All right, so let me read this little section. It's going to go over more scientific points of interest, and let's see if we can build a case that supports the claims of our ancestors. This section is called Upheaval. There is absolutely no doubt that the stupendous natural forces connected with mountain building are closely related to large-scale deformation of the Earth's crust, and that many of the world's highest ranges originated in and even attained their present elevations during crustal disturbances that signaled the end of the Pleistocene times. Now remember, the Pleistocene times are the Ice Age times. So what we just read there basically says the mountains rose up after the Ice Age was over. Varying amounts of increasing elevation occurred sporadically down to the close of the Pleistocene. We do urge, however, that a high percentage of today's major ranges rose to their present heights only at the end of or after Pleistocene times. By general consensus of opinion, that event occurred about 11,000 years before the present. Before then, as demonstrated by numerous geological facts and observations, mountains were mostly of very modest elevation. Evidence supporting that contention is both widespread and convincing. The geological modernity of folded mountains in many parts of Asia was recognized early this century by Dr. Bailey Willis when he wrote how they challenge credulity by their extreme youth. His conclusions, confirmed by studies of mountain ranges in China, where huge uplifts of the Earth's crust were found to have occurred since the glacial period. Similar youthfulness characteristics the ranges bordering the western Gobi Desert, including all of those from the Russian Altai Mountains to the Tian Shan Range. Indeed, it has been said of this region that, quote, "The present Gobi Basin is relatively young, and was formed coincidentally with the uplift of the Trans-Baikal Ranges," unquote. Certainly within human memory, a large inland sea, referred to in ancient Chinese records as the Great Han Hai, occupied the Gobi Desert. This apparently extended from the Great Khingan Shan in the east to the Tian Shan and Pamir ranges in the west, a distance of some 2,000 miles, and from north to south, a distance of some 700 miles. That's one hell of a lake that no longer exists. And that's another thing to think about. We're just talking about mountain ranges eventually in this show, but the mountain ranges are not an isolated event. If you have mountain ranges being ripped up, you're going to have other problems as well. So they will show you some of that. So just keep that in mind. This is not an isolated situation. In fact, another thing to take into account when we're listening to this stuff is that we would expect to find all kinds of other events taking place because of the mountains being created. So we should be looking for the effects of such an upheaval. If those effects are not in our ancestors' stories, then, they're probably suspect. But if we are finding the kinds of stories that these guys are recording actually has the scientific stuff that we would expect, the scientific consequences that should be experienced, if the histories have it, that is a point in their general direction that they are telling the truth. Remember that. You have to look at the entire picture. Don't segregate any of this stuff. Everything is connected. Like literally everything is connected in this history. It's crazy. Okay, I know. Let's keep going. The Great Lakes volume was accordingly immense. At the time of the sea's existence, the entire basin apparently lay from 2,000 to 3,000 feet lower than it does today. And there is every indication that it was uplifted simultaneously not only with the Pamirs and the Great Ranges of the Western China, but also with the Tibetan Plateau immediately to the south. The draining away of the water constituting this inland sea must have been a truly devastating event. The same upheaval affected the mountainous region of northern China too, where huge lava outpourings occurred on the Great Qinghan Shan. Not improbably, these events were concurrent with the similarly large basaltic flows on the neighboring Sikoti Allen Range, and with the spectacular collapse of the seafloor by many thousands of meters along the eastern shoreline of the present Kamcha Peninsula, all the way to the islands of Japan. That's some serious destruction, right? This is a world... Okay. The Bayan Kara Shan range in the western China was upheaved some 6,500 feet. Minya Konka, one of the world's highest peaks, was uplifted 3,250 feet. More or less coincidentally with the elevations of the ranges in the Yunnan province by at least 6,500 feet. Southwards, the Tibetan Plateau was elevated by a still greater amount, 9,750 feet. Opinions differ whether this took place in early or late Pleistocene times, but as this uplift is known to have been coincident with the elevation of the Himalayas to their present height, which according to Flint and others occurred at or just after the end of Pleistocene times, we are probably justified in ascribing a like date to the Tibetan disturbances as well. And that's true, right? What they're finding is they're finding scientific evidence that corroborates all of our ancestor stories that say these mountains sprung up due to one major catastrophic event. So the scientific evidence that we find is exactly what we would expect if it was true. All right. Flint linked this Himalayan uprise with the formation of other major Earth features. Thus, quote, Lake Pleistocene uplift occurred in the Himalayan region and in the Alps, and large-scale rifting took place in eastern Africa, unquote. Among other ranges affected then were the Cordilleran systems in both North and South America, the Caucasus, and many others. Wadia confirmed this with regard to Himalayan mountain building when he wrote, quote, Evidence of the extreme youth of Himalayan mountain building has multiplied over recent years. The tilting and elevation of the Pleistocene lake and river deposits of the Kashmir Valley containing fossil plants and vertebrates to a height of 5,000 and 6,000 feet. The dissection of river terraces containing post-tertiary mammalia to a depth of over 3,000 feet, and the overthrusting of the older Himalayan rocks upon Pleistocene gravel and alluvia of the plains have been noted by the Geological Survey of India and other observers." Unquote. Basically, one of the things that they discovered, I don't know if they're going to talk about this, but they found that older strata had literally been ripped out of the earth and thrown on top of newer strata. That's insane. And by the way, that's on a scale of hundreds of miles. All right, let's keep going. Astonishing as it may seem, this overthrusting of older upon newer formations was attended by the dragging up by more than 5,000 feet of marine beds containing Paleolithic remains in Kashmir and occurred during the Age of Humanity. The Indian geologist M.S. Krishan traced evidence for an extraordinarily massive uplift of the Pir Panjal Mountains, also in Kashmir, which attained an even greater elevation. He noted, quote, "The last stage of the uplift, which must have been of the order The last stage of the uplift, which must have been of the order of 6,000 feet, is believed to have occurred since the advent of early man. This upheaval has not only elevated the Pir Panjal and folded and tilted the Karawas, but has also affected the rocks of the Patwar and the Salt Range." Unquote. Not only were the Himalayas and their satellite ranges affected by this gigantic crustal uplift, but so also were the Pamirs, the Hindu Kush, Karakoram, and Kailas ranges, the Kunlun Mountains, and the Altai and Tian Shan ranges, all of which rose to their present altitudes geologically very, very recently. After detailed studies of the Nanga Parbat Massif in the western Himalayas, Dr. P. Finstwalder concluded that its uprise was immediately post-glacial. Such crustal movements understandably affected local natural drainage, rivers there exhibiting repeated proofs of rejuvenation due to the uplifted watersheds. The course of the Narbada River, which has been changed by, quote, late earth movements, unquote, is a fine instance of this, while the precipitous waterfalls at Jabalpur owe their present spectacular image to the same cause. Comparably, vast changes in the elevation of hills and mountains and of a reorganized water pattern took place about the same time in Burma, and undoubtedly extended to northern Thailand, Laos, and parts of Vietnam as far as Malaya. Uprised beaches along the latter's coast show, quote, "a recession of the sea and a lowering of the sea level of at least 50 feet. There is evidence that the sea level has fallen more than 300 feet in the area including Mount Ophir and Kedah Peak, since or during Pleistocene times." Unquote. Might not the elevation of these beaches have resulted as much from an uprise of the land as from a drop in sea level? Such an explanation would accord with Grove's statement that, quote, "should one, nevertheless, cling to the theory of submerged continents, the only alternative would be to assume that while vast blocks were being submerged in one area, parts of the ocean floor of almost identical size were being elevated in others. Unquote. You Atlantis researchers hear that? Yeah, things get interesting. Remember, it's not just mountains that are built during this event. We lose huge chunks of land. Let's keep going. In other words, when portions of the Earth's crust sink in one place, other portions tend to rise elsewhere in compensation. Space limitations preclude more than the most cursory references to the similar and apparently coeval evidence known from the Philippines, various parts of Indonesia, the Pacific generally, and Australia. So suffice here to assert that much of the topography of all of these regions came into being a mere 11,000 years ago. Basically, what these authors are saying, these scientists, these geologists with degrees, is they are making the claim in the scientific statement that there are huge land masses that we no longer have access to because they are thousands, if not tens of thousands of feet under the water. Yeah, okay. Before that date, it was markedly different. Much of the same can be said to the present alpine scenery in Europe. Not so long ago, geologically speaking, they were little more than a chain of low hills. But judging from the undercited remarks of Dr. Reginald Daly of Harvard, the processes by which they acquired their present character involved a truly appalling paroxysm of nature. Quote, during the building of the Alps, gigantic slabs of rock, thousands of feet thick, hundreds of miles long, and tens of miles wide, were thrust up and then over relatively to the rocks beneath. The direction of the relative overthrusting movement was from Africa towards the main mass of Europe to the north. The visible rocks of the northern Alps of Switzerland have thus been shoved northwards distances in the order of hundreds of miles. In a sense, the Alps used to be on the present site of northern Italy. Unquote. In effect, the present Alps represent a crustal shortening of about 100 kilometers, which some authorities have suggested was as much as 600 kilometers. This was caused by a variety of interrelated processes, including massive overthrusting of older upon younger strata analogous to that previously noted in the Himalayas. Overthrusting on a grand scale is common, for instance, in the Jura Mountains, while that in the Glarus Mountains in East Switzerland is traceable for many miles and is a showpiece of alpine geology. The Siberian and Glarnish peaks are arresting examples of stratal inversion, and the Rogenstock, the Monk, and the mighty Jogfra no less so. Yeah, I know, I'm not very good at reading these names. Just deal with it. Go get the book. Although various explanations of the precise modus operandi of these processes have been proposed from time to time, their cause and development are still imperfectly understood. And the reality is, mainstream geology does not understand it at all. They just fall back onto their plate tectonic situation, and they ignore all of this evidence that we are presenting to you right now. Right? Did you learn any of this stuff in geology class? Did you even take a geology class? It's crazy. Why wasn't this kind of stuff front and center when we start to learn about geology? This is a legitimate problem. It's almost like there are people out there who don't want us to know the truth, but that would never be real because that's a conspiracy theory. Nobody with power would ever want more power. That would never happen, right? Okay. Where the hell were we? Eric Harmon advocated that the great rock masses were forced to slide over one another by their own tremendous weight. But the role played in this process by plutonic melts, and plutonic melts are layers of molten rocks that are formed deep within the earth, at least that's what they think they are, such as would permit this has yet to be clarified. Right? Most of this stuff is not clarified. Right? When you go and you start to look at mainstream geological excuses for, events that took place or observations, geologists, they are literally making stuff up in some cases. And if you question them, then they just say, well, I can't prove it because it happened 20 billion years ago. So I can't, what do you want from me, bro? It's like you just grab them by the hair, throw them off a cliff. Because it doesn't matter. See if they can count the layers while they're flying through the air towards the ground. Of the cliff. Okay, not the ground of the cliff. Count the layers of the cliff as they fall to the ground. Nevertheless, Harriman's hypothesis is perhaps still the most attractive of those available. Certainly, the juggernaut-like progress of billions of tons of rock over surface strata, crushing and obliterating everything in its path, is almost unimaginable, right? Because how did that happen? We have never seen a huge mountain range pop up out of nowhere and then just slide along a huge chunk of the continent, right? We've never seen that. But that does not mean it did not happen. Remember that just because we do not see a process right now in action, that does not mean that process does not exist. Uniformitarianists need to be hunted in the street and executed. Professor Oswald Herr associated this convulsion with the glacial epoch during the late Pleistocene times. Today, the summits of three of the highest alpine peaks, Mount Blanc, Mount Rosa, and the Matterhorn respectively, stand 15,781 feet, 15,217 feet, and 14,691 feet above sea level. If we assume the description of the Proto-Alps as low hills to signify no more than, say, 2,000 feet, the uprise involved must have been as much as 12 to 13,000 feet. A stratal uplift of this magnitude is positively staggering, while the heat generated by the physical overthrusting and inversion of such gigantic rocky masses must have been appalling. And sure enough, we find that exact situation happening in our ancestors' stories. There's a really good one in North America. We have in the northwestern continent of North America, there is a huge lava field there with no volcanoes around. Even more interesting is that they discovered underneath this 1,000-foot lava field up there in North America, or up here, whatever, they found remnants of civilizations underneath the lava flow. How do you like that? And those civilizations are not millions of years old. Those civilizations were dated only a few thousand years ago. Yeah, it gets absolutely insane. Remember, like I said, if we're going to make a claim that the mountains are being, upthrust overnight, there are going to be scientific consequences. Heat is going to be one of those consequences. So we should be looking out for stories that have some sort of crazy heat involved. And we find those everywhere that mountain building happens during this period of time. We'll talk more about that on a different show later, but it does exist. Just keep that in mind. All right. It is necessary here to review all the great mountain systems of the world. We may pass on to consider just a few outstanding examples from Africa and the Americas. merely pausing en route to note that the elevation of the Norwegian mountains with their fjords is thought to have been late glacial or even post-glacial. Yeah, the fjords. Isn't that crazy that they're willing to say that all of those fjords up there, they were all created after the Ice Age. They have not been sitting there for billions of years. Fjords are insane. Let's see if he gets to that. Almost certainly, the mountain building just discussed was coeval with crustal dislocations along the northwest African coast and in the adjacent Atlas Mountains. The latter, in particular the anti-Atlas, formerly extended into the present Atlantic Ocean at least as far as the Canary Islands. The subsidence of this earlier westerly prolongation of Africa, marked by gross local distortions of strata, occurred in the late Pleistocene or the earliest Holocene times. Significantly coincidental with this subsidence, the Hogar and Air regions of the Sahara far to the southeast were evidently in the process of being abruptly upheaved. Unquestionably, these elevatory and depressive crustal movements, the emptying of, in some localities, of lakes and inland seas, and the creation and enlarging of rivers elsewhere, were intimately connected with huge tectonic disturbances of the kind that produced the Great Rift Valley of East Africa, a feature commonly assigned to the late glacial times. These geophysical changes find almost exactly similar parallels in the Americas. Referring to the Western Cordilleras, referring to the Western Cordilleras of North America, Daly remarked, quote, "The whole Rocky Mountain front for hundreds of miles has been pushed up and then out many miles over the plains," unquote. Writing specifically of Chief Mountain in Montana, he noted how it was, quote, "thrust bodily upon much younger strata of the Great Plains, and then driven over them eastwards for a distance of at least 8 miles. Indeed, the thrust may have been several times 8 miles," unquote. And remember, these events right here, these mountains over thrusting, the North American Indians have the mythologies of witnessing these events. Like I said, we'll do another show that gets more into detail, but think about that. If this happened within the memory of humankind, then we would expect to find stories, and yeah, sure enough, they're right there. Such crustal dislocations embraced enormous areas and titanic tonnage. For example, all of the Glacier National Park in Montana and all the Rocky Mountain area up to Yellowhead Pass in Alberta was moved laterally for many miles. These mountains, therefore, afford strident echoes of the situation already recorded in the Alps and the Himalayas, and it is certainly no surprise to find Dr. Forrest adding, quote, "There is a good body of evidence that the elevation of the western part of North America, like that of Norway, was post-glacial or late glacial. This is not 10 million years old. These ranges are not 100 million years old. These are brand new mountains." And how do you like that? This is legitimately mainstream geologists making these claims. We don't hear about this. I wonder why. Considering the coast ranges of Southern California, Another authority observed, quote, "There, within the short limits of the Pleistocene epoch, strata a mile thick were deposited," unquote. A mile thick of strata overnight. Insane. These were later intensely eroded and deformed, being finally uplifted a quarter of a mile above the sea. The last episode is demonstrated by a flight of marine terraces which marches like a cyclopean stairway up the seaward slope of some parts of the range. This rate of deposition, not to mention the degree of crustal uplift, itself late or post-glacial age, hugely transcended the norm demanded by Lyell's gradualism, as also did the geologically very recent and cataclysmic stratal contortion and upheaval by at least 6,500 feet of the Cascade Mountains and the Sierra Nevada in Oregon and Eastern California. Now remember, Lyell is the guy that started the whole uniformitarianism thing, so if you ever develop a time machine, feel free to go back in time and hunt him for sport. I will literally give you 50 cents for it. It's fine, I do not mind. South of the equator, the mighty Andes everywhere exhibit signs of extreme youthfulness. The longest continuous range on Earth, the Andes are actually very ancient mountains which only acquired their present striking relief at the end of the Pleistocene times. This has been described as geologically very rapid and attended by intense volcanisms, several of the volcanoes attaining enormous heights. The Andean uplift was immense, with mountain passes in Peru and Bolivia often lying as much as 13,000 feet above sea level. Everywhere the rugged and jagged profiles of the Andean peaks bespeak a violent, catastrophic formation. Confronting us at almost every turn are abundant, indisputable, and tellingly consistent evidences of a geologically recent, worldwide mountain building characterized by crustal dislocations, uplifts, and faulting on a gargantuan scale. Recognition of the truly global dimensions of this mountain building has been long voiced by geophysicists. Reviewing mountains generally, Dr. Walter Butcher of Columbia University has observed, quote, "Taken in their entirety, the mountain building belts are the result of worldwide stresses that have acted on the crust as a whole. Certainly, the pattern of these belts is not what one would expect from wholly independent, purely local changes in the crust." Unquote. A possibly even greater authority, Venning Meneses, asserted that, quote, "If we examine the pattern of great geosynclines, large geological troughs, over the Earth's surface, we can not doubt that their cause must have been of a worldwide character." Unquote. Remember, these guys are mainstream geologists, and right now they are admitting that something worldwide on a catastrophic scale must have taken place to create these mountain ranges. Okay. Commenting upon the same phenomena, Dr. J.H.F. Umbergrove admitted, quote, "I feel as if there is overwhelming evidence that the movements are the expression of a worldwide active and deep-seated cause." Unquote. A very large number of similar opinions could be cited, together with a large array of varying hypotheses that explain the causes of the orogeny. Orogeny is mountain building, by the way. It is unnecessary to indulge in this here, although we would again emphasize the general agreement that some worldwide cause was responsible for the phenomena just discussed. Suffice it to observe that something acting on a planetary scale and with staggering power was basically responsible for these titanic crustal disturbances in times geologically very recent. Described by one writer as, quote, a remarkable and stupendous period, a period so startling that it might justly be accepted with hesitation were not the conception unavoidable before a series of facts as extraordinary as itself. Unquote. That's the end of that section. Yeah, I know I suck at reading, by the way. Don't get on me. I'm trying, okay? I'm trying to get better at this crap. Anyway, the information is what matters, not how I sound, okay? Anyway, isn't that insane? We right here have tons of mainstream geologists coming to the conclusion that something horrifically catastrophic had to have happened to this planet not that long ago, like only a few thousand years ago, to create the mountain ranges that we currently have on this planet. Why is this not being taught in schools? I mean, this outcome, this conclusion is literally based on facts and evidence. Remember, facts and evidence do not care about your feelings either. Remember, for everybody who believes in plate tectonics, for everybody who believes that mountains take millions of years to build, that's nice, but it does not follow the evidence. There's no evidence for any of that, and you can't even prove it. Never forget, by the way, that the plate tectonic theory has precisely 0 predictions to its name. 0 successful predictions to its name. None. 0. There's nothing. We can't predict earthquakes. We cannot predict volcanoes. We cannot predict anything with the theory of plate tectonics. We have to get rid of it. Now, the other ramifications of this are, of course, that if we do not have mountains existing in their current state now, 20, 30, 50,000 years ago, that means that the Ice Age is now an impossibility. Because remember, glaciers, or the ice sheets, whatever they want to call them, these processes require mountain ranges. Don't forget that for a glacier to be able to be mobile, and it had to be mobile because apparently, these ice sheets covered huge tracts of Earth magically, you need mountain ranges to push the glaciers, right? Glaciers will start on the top of mountains, a high energy potential, and then as they go down, they expend their energy and they go to a lower energy potential. That is how glaciers are supposed to spread. If we do not have mountain ranges before the Pleistocene, right before the Ice Age, how is there an Ice Age? Answer the question. I want to see a geologist answer that question. It's not possible. And just to tell you what they will tell you, actually, if you point this information out, and it's all scientific. They don't argue it. There's nothing to argue. It's right there. It's right in front of them. It's scientific facts. If you point that out to them, then what they will then tell you is they'll say, well, yeah, but ice sheets work completely differently, bro. They're not like glaciers. Even though we keep telling everybody that they're like glaciers or that they are glaciers, if you really question us, suddenly they're ice sheets. It's so unbelievably frustrating. It's the dumbest stuff you can imagine. And these people believe it, right? This is a testament to psychological conditioning and programming. It is unbelievable. Even when the evidence is put right in front of them, they don't want to see it. And they don't want to see it because they have already made up their mind. This is not how we do science. All right. So I think at this point we can, hopefully we've built up a foundation of understanding that the Ice Age could not have existed because the evidence shows that the mountains did not exist. So we can start to discard the Ice Age, right? For this reason alone. We're going to go into more topics after this, and we will continue to build a case that gets rid of the Ice Age. Now, not only are we trying to get rid of the Ice Age, all of this mountain building stuff is important to you as an ancient historical researcher. Because as you read all of our ancestors' histories, they're talking about this kind of crazy stuff. So now when you hear the North American Indians say something like, Vulture created the Rockies, instead of discarding that, take that seriously. Maybe they did see something that they called Vulture creating the mountains. Of course, that brings up the question, what the hell is Vulture? Now, your average person is going to think vulture, a bird, whatever, it's a regular bird, flies around, eats dead things. How the hell did that create a mountain? What if the word vulture is not to be taken literally, but it is to be taken simply as a name that they ascribed to a different entity? What if that entity is not an imaginary bird? What if it was a cosmological body? What if that entity was a planet that did a close flyby of Earth? With that said, we will continue to build up a case that the things that our ancestors recorded in their histories was not fictitious. These were not fantastical stories. These were real events. We are just not taking the time to understand them.